Good morning, and welcome to the First Unitarian Church of Salt Lake City. I'm the Reverend Monica Dobbins, the assistant minister of this congregation, and it is my joy to welcome you here today on this blustery Sunday morning. If you're visiting for the first time or want to learn more about our church or our faith, please stop by the welcome table just right outside this door after worship, and we would be delighted to meet you and introduce ourselves. The topic I chose to talk about today is what our women can do, which begs the logical answer, what can't they do? I could just stop right there and we can all go have coffee. But of course, it's not that simple, is it? First of all, the coffee team likes it when I preach until 10, so I don't know why that is. But also, we do not live in a society with only one gender. We are all in this together. We depend on each other. And when one gender of people has more say than others, our whole society loses out, including that one more privileged gender. So to open our service today, I want to lift up the name Florence Price, a name you've already seen today in your order of service. Price was the first black woman to have her music played by a major American orchestra when the Chicago Symphony played her symphony in E minor in 1933. But sadly, Price's music went largely ignored by the public during her lifetime, and indeed, many of her works have only just lately been discovered. Black and female, in a cultural sphere that could only find value in the works of conservatory-trained white men. It is a small wonder we don't whistle her tunes as we might Bach, Brahms, or Beethoven. Alex Ross, writing in The New Yorker, says, "The obvious objection that could be lodged against the modest Florence Price revival is that the composer benefits from special pleading. If she were not black and a woman, would she be played?" But other hypotheticals could be asked as well. If racism and misogyny had not so profoundly defined European and American culture, would as many white male composers, have prospered? Even today, as cultural institutions of all stripes feel the righteous pressure to diversify their payrolls and their output, that same Chicago Symphony announced that its upcoming season would include no compositions by women, not a single one. Can you imagine if they announced a season without a single male composer? This is not just a thought exercise, it is a vital practice of cultural imagination. One crucial antidote to racism and sexism is for those of us who have privilege to grasp the paucity of our uniform experience, and then to imagine and cultivate a richer experience by letting go of the familiar and embracing the diversity that has been suppressed. And so this morning, I want to thank our music director, David Owens, for blessing us with exposure to a composer whose time has come. We light our chalice this morning with these words from Selena Fox. "We light this flame with love for women past, present, and future. We light this flame in celebration of community and its generations. We light this flame with respect and support for the greater circle of life of which we are all a part." Isn't that a neat sound when the organ opens up? Oh, I love it. Let's rise in body or in spirit and sing together. Number 126. Something has shifted in the world this week. 17 precious families are grieving. 17 beautiful souls are lost. 17 lives cut short. 17 holes ripped in the fabric of a community. 17 more. 17 that we add to the 132 people killed in mass school shootings since Columbine, and 3,000 more people that we add to the 150,000 Americans who have experienced a shooting on campus during their lifetimes. But something else has shifted in the world this week. This week, after the shooting, after the tweets and the think pieces and the hand-wringing and the futile calls for reform, the children took a stand. The children who have to live in this fearful space walked out of their classrooms and said, "Enough." They fearlessly called out the dirty money and rejected the useless thoughts and prayers. The children spoke prophetically. We are kids. You are the adults here. Do something. So today's prayer is for the children, not for their safety alone. We've prayed that prayer long enough. Today's prayer is for their power and their courage. Today we pray that they will turn the world upside down. Right now, I invite you to close your eyes, to enter into a spirit of meditation, and imagine the face of just one young person who is going to turn the world upside down. And ask yourself what you can do to protect them long enough to let them do it. And if what you feel is helplessness or hopelessness or frustration or anger, let yourself feel it. And then go beyond helplessness and anger to pride in these children, to pride in our communities that hold together, to determination that we are not powerless. Another way is possible. Let's keep the promise that they ask us to make, that we will do something. Amen. This morning's reading comes from Marcy Bianco at Stanford University. In order to succeed, feminism needs to work within the very systems women want to change. And this means that women must reconsider their relation to power and power structures. Feminism in the digital age has positioned itself as opposed to power, whether manifest in the hashtag mantra of resist or through the consumerist vein of fempowerment, decorated with cupcakes and knitted hats. Women are more comfortable, arguably, with protesting and resisting than with leading, because leading demands that we actually try to work with in order to reform the very structures that oppress us. Power is complex, yet in itself is not negative or bad, and it doesn't have to be consigned to the sole possession of patriarchy. To quote the feminist philosopher Elizabeth Gross, if feminists believe that their goal is to abandon power, then they have already lost the game from which they cannot withdraw. Feminism's uneasy relation to power is something that conservative women like Kellyanne Conway touch upon when they deride it as an anti-male movement made up of women who have a problem with power. The narrative is that feminism is anti-male is a deliberate misinterpretation intended to slander the movement. But Conway and others are correct in observing the movement's antithetical relation to power. Is power inherently patriarchal? How do women get it and use it? To push the point a bit farther is the pseudo-feminist cultural discourse around empowerment, a recognition of women's failure to actually have power. Because you don't hear men talking about empowerment or feeling empowered. People who have power do not dream about empowerment. In philosophy, freedom of thought is the ultimate form of liberation. In the context of power, reimagining how we think about power is the first fundamental step to eradicating the systematic oppression of women. As a force, power is not inherently sexist, but it has been historically harnessed to perpetuate women's oppression. If we understand that power knows no gender and that women can be powerful, then we can upend the traditional narratives that have fixed feminism in a spin cycle for the past 100 years. It is my argument that the missing link between hope and change is power. So, how do we as feminists attempt to reimagine and positively reorient ourselves toward power when for so long we have been conditioned to refuse it, when we have become more comfortable resisting than leading in the world? Feminism as a politics is a movement among people, but as an ethics, it begins as a movement within the self. I think this is where we have to begin, within the self. Social pressures and conformity are not qualities of independent thinking, but dangerous omens of fascism and cultural decline. Instead of taking the definition of feminism as truth, we need to question what it is and what feminism means in this new century. We need to question the meaning of empowerment and seek power rather than work to corrode it in others. We need to question equality and whether we shouldn't replace this desired ideal with that of freedom. We need to question the impulse to decenter women. We need to imagine what feminism looks like in action, in policy, and in society. And then we need to develop the strategies to achieve those ends, because the future of women's existence depends on it. It's always busy at First Unitarian Church. So many things going on and so many wonderful ministries that our folks are involved in. So I'd encourage you to have a look at what's in the order of service, and I also want to draw your attention to just a few special things. First, due to popular demand, more seats have been added to a First Church radio show from 1947 called Wanna Dance. This Saturday night, February 24th, it features our own Reverend Tom Goldsmith as the host, Ralph Waldo. Where'd he get that name from? The Stratford Street Big Band, and our own Java Jive with skits, commercials by the Twitter sisters, and plenty of fun. It's at the Sugar Space Art Warehouse, and we have tickets for sale today in Elliott Hall, just $25. Second, if you'll have a look at the back of your order of service, if you're feeling stressed out and disconnected, you are invited to participate in a drop-in class called The Inward Path, Spiritual Practices for the Season of Lent. Now, it's not really so much a class. I can't think of a better word to call it. But in any case, you can walk a temporary labyrinth, engage in meditative adult coloring, and listen to chant on your schedule. You can drop in for an hour or stay for the whole time, and just read the back of the order of service for more details on that. And finally, Celebration Sunday. It is coming March 4th. It's always one of the highlights of the church calendar year. It marks the kickoff for our pledge drive for the new fiscal year. This year's celebration will include our featured guest speaker, Lily Eskelsen Garcia. She was an active member of our church and was a strong influence on our social justice efforts in the 80s and 90s. She is currently president of the National Education Association and was once Utah's Teacher of the Year. Lily has always had the gift of living her UU values, especially in her professional life, known for her humor, folk singing, and blunt talking. Lily is the perfect speaker for Celebration Sunday. So we invite all of you to join us on that special day. And now at this time, we will gratefully receive the offering and have a chance to welcome one another, whether old-timers or new-timers. I spent January of 2017, as I had the previous 2 Januaries, in Chicago as a student at Meadville Lombard Theological School. And on one blustery but clear January morning, we students pleaded with our professor to give us a long lunch so we could join the 500,000 people gathering on Michigan Avenue below our window, preparing to participate in the largest one-day demonstration in American history. We spent the long hours of lecture that week knitting bright pink hats. Here's the one I made that week, having learned how to knit for the first time. I can knit a little better now, but it was serviceable. I borrowed some poster board and thick markers from the craft closet and quickly made some picket signs, and then we took to the streets, the chants ringing off the walls of the skyscrapers on Wabash Avenue. I bet a lot of people in this room still have those bright pink hats in their closets. I sometimes wonder why I don't see people wearing them about now. I sure do remember how proud we were of those hats, and I remember how fierce I felt in those days right after the Women's March when I would see a spot of bright pink in a crowd or behind the wheel of a car. There are days when it seems like years have passed between the Women's March and the Me Too movement, rather than only one short year. The pink hat was a creative response to the Billy Bush video released during the presidential campaign in which the male presidential candidate bragged about his ability to assault women. After that video surfaced, as at so many other moments, I thought, surely this will be the turning point. As the Me Too movement has shown, there is hardly a woman alive in this country who is not moving through every day of her life carrying the scars of sexual harassment and assault. Hard to imagine even one woman voting for a man who would so brazenly assault women. And yet, 64% of white women voted for Trump, a statistic that never ceases to amaze me. Why? And time again, I remind myself that though I grew up in white Christian fundamentalism, the ability to embrace feminism and choose a full and equitable life for myself came with enormous privilege and came at enormous personal cost. So many women count the cost of pursuing their full potential and find it still too high. The last time I ever entered a congregation of the fundamentalist church of my upbringing, I was a 19-year-old music student and already conducting ensembles and performing publicly, and was for the first time developing a real feminist consciousness, certainly not something to which I'd had much exposure growing up. I walked into that church and I saw a fresh new bulletin board decorated by the girls in the middle school Sunday school class with the title, What Our Women Can Do. You might guess some of the suggestions: cooking meals for the sick, sending get well cards, teaching Sunday school for small children. Only small children because, of course, once the boys were baptized, no matter their age, they had authority over women. There's the magic word, authority. Closely linked to power, though not exactly the same thing. It wasn't that these tasks weren't important or lacked spiritual value, but they didn't require the same kinds of authority as the tasks from which women were being systematically excluded. Teaching, scriptural interpretation, business management, preaching, leadership. And to separate these tasks along gender lines was to devalue the work being relegated to women. Furthermore, the practice contradicted Scripture. From 1 Corinthians chapter 12, now there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of Spirit for the common good. To one is given the spirit of the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another, gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another, the working of miracles. To another, prophecy. To another, the discernment of spirits. To another, various kinds of tongues. To another, the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually, just as the Spirit chooses. Now, why, I wondered, as a young woman, would God give a woman a gift and then instruct the men around her to devalue and ignore it? I never claimed to be a miracle worker or an interpreter of tongues, but prophecy, the gift of calling people in power to account. Now that gift was in my wheelhouse. Who was to say that that gift in the body of a woman was weakness? I walked out, and I never went back. It was around that time that I read Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique for the first time. Despite the fact that it was already 30 years old and fell under scrutiny for its limited view on race and class, nevertheless, it helped me to name for myself the problem that I had seen on that bulletin board in the church hallway. Restrictive gender roles were not only endemic to the fundamentalist church in which I grew up, they were endemic to American society, harming people of all genders and holding everybody back. Not only that, but gender roles are sneaky. It's one thing to insist on girly colors or drinks or jobs. Who does that anymore? But it is another thing to recognize when we have internalized the messages of sexism. When I entered the workforce, women assumed they would be taken seriously and treated equally, and were bitterly disappointed to find that nobody had actually shut down the old boys club. You still had to be pretty, approachable, and unthreatening to get the job, which turned out to be the very same characteristics that made women vulnerable to sexual harassment. Have things changed? We can look to Hollywood and follow the hashtags, to Harvey Weinstein, to Louis C.K., even back to Woody Allen, who still has not been held accountable. We can look to the 700,000 female farm workers who wrote an open letter of solidarity with the actresses who had been harassed by those men who don't get a glamorous awards show in which to address their industry's malfeasance. And then there is Silicon Valley, a place that seems so progressive, and yet women are not only hired at half the rate of men, they leave the industry at twice the rate of men. One woman in Silicon Valley told Liza Mundy of The Atlantic about how she learned to calibrate the temperature of her demeanor. Neither too intimate nor too distant. She learned the fine art of the three-quarters smile, as well as how to deflect conversation away from her personal life and return it to topics like sports and market strategy. She learned to distinguish between actual predators and well-meaning guys who were just a bit clueless, and yet to not be overly wary, because that too can affect career prospects. Mundy lays out the ways that sexism affects women in tech. They are interrupted in meetings more often than men. They are evaluated on their personality in ways that men are not. They are less likely to get funding from venture capitalists who, studies also show, find pitches delivered by men, especially handsome men, more persuasive. And in a particularly cruel irony, women's contributions to open source software are accepted more often than men's are, but only if their gender is unknown. It seems that the boys' club has merely been replaced with the bros' club. So then, 50 years after the feminine mystique, when we can plainly see that sexism is still a daily reality for women and that the costs of pursuing equity are still high, I want to ask the question, what is the masculine mystique? A timely question in a week when we hear of yet another school shooting carried out by a violent and angry young man. In fact, out of all the mass shootings since 1982, all but 3 have been carried out by men. And though the perpetrators are too often characterized as men of color and or mentally ill, the characteristics that more accurately generalize them are that they are white and that they have either domestic violence or workplace disgruntlement in their profile, or both. leading us to recognize their sense of entitlement and their profound anger at not getting that to which they feel entitled. Historian Stephanie Kuntz describes a pervasive masculine mystique that pressures men and boys to conform to a gender stereotype and prevents them from exploring the full range of their individual capabilities. Kuntz says, the masculine mystique promises men success, power, and admiration from others if they embrace their supposedly natural competitive drives and reject all forms of dependence. Just as the feminine mystique made women ashamed if they harbored feelings or desires that were supposedly masculine, the masculine mystique makes men ashamed to admit to any feelings or desires that are thought to be feminine. All manner of behaviors, from crying in public to studying hard and achieving good grades, from caring for one's own physical health to caring for the needs of others, are feminized and seen as a departure from real manhood. In fact, NFL coach Joe Ehrmans has said that the three most destructive words that every man receives when he's a boy is when he's told to be a man. And that destructiveness expresses itself in domestic violence, in public violence, in the ordinary, everyday violence of cutting off what makes men human and wonderful. But masculinity is no more an indication of genuine maleness than femininity of genuine femaleness. So why do people continue to believe in the myth of the real man? What if we reimagined what real manliness is and hold men accountable to that standard? And correspondingly, what if women no longer feel beholden to male standards of behavior and could truly bring all of their gifts to the table? What if the ability to express one's emotions was not a liability but an asset? What if every time a woman was interrupted, another man asked that man to be quiet and asked the woman to begin again? What if women made up 50% of every office, every meeting, every organization, every legislature, every public arena? And what if their gifts, the gifts of women and the gifts of womanhood, were seen not only as valuable, but essential and irreplaceable? And what if men refused to work in all male spaces, sought out female supervisors and mentors, passed on insider advice and wisdom to junior women, fought as hard for pay equity and reproductive justice as they do for anything else? Parenting and faith blogger Glennon Doyle writes about one of her children's teachers who has a peculiar classroom practice. Every Friday afternoon, she asks her students to take out a piece of paper and write down the names of 4 children with whom they'd like to sit the following week. The children know that these requests may or may not be honored. She also asks the students to nominate one student who they believe has been an exceptional classroom citizen that week. All ballots are privately submitted to her. And every single afternoon, after the students go home, she takes out those slips of paper, places them in front of her, and studies them. She looks for patterns. Who is not getting requested by anybody else? Who can't think of anyone to request? Who never gets noticed enough to be nominated? Who had 1 million friends last week and none this week? Doyle says, this teacher is not looking for a new seating chart or exceptional citizens. This teacher is looking for lonely children. She's looking for children who are struggling to connect with other children. She's identifying the little ones who are falling through the cracks of the class's social life. She is discovering whose gifts are going unnoticed by their peers, and she's pinning down right away who's being bullied and who is doing the bullying. As the teacher explains this simple, ingenious idea, Doyle says she stared at her with my mouth hanging open. "How long have you been using this system?" I said. "Ever since Columbine," she said. "Every single Friday afternoon since Columbine." This brilliant woman watched Columbine knowing that all violence begins with disconnection. All outward violence begins as inner loneliness. She watched that tragedy knowing that children who aren't being noticed may eventually resort to being noticed by any means necessary. And so she has decided to start fighting violence early and often in the world within her reach. This is what this woman could do to fight the toxic masculinity she witnessed in society and to replace it with love. All violence begins with disconnection. Disconnection from society and disconnection from oneself. Disconnection that leaves us with missing pieces of ourselves. How do we go forward together as men and women? How do we renegotiate our social agreements? Men, what parts of yourselves have you pushed down for too long? What parts of the puzzles of your heart need to be put back in place in order for you to become whole? Women, what is just beyond your reach? What is standing in your way? How can you carry another woman up with you? And for those of you who do not find yourselves on either side of the gender binary, what have you gained and lost in the process of finding a whole self that feels right and authentic? Women, the answer at the end of this hour is the same as it was when we began. What can our women do? What can't they do? We can heal the world and make it whole with the gifts we have been given, no matter what color hat you're wearing. Now, I invite you to rise in body or spirit once more, and let's sing together as one community. Number 323, we'll sing only the first two verses. We extinguish our chalice this morning with these words from African-American poet and activist June Jordan. In addition to the traditional concept of true commitment that means you are willing to die for what you think is right, make equal space for the womanly concept of commitment that means you are willing to live for what you believe.